evening and welcome to today's virtual Weinstein Author Series program with Kim Roberts and her book by Broad Potomac Shore, Great Poems from the Early Days of Our Nation's Capital. My name is Scott Dodson. I'm the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Before we begin, a few notes on today's presentation. Today's program is made possible thanks to the generous support of Carol and Marcus Weinstein and Weinstein Properties. We're so very grateful for their support of the library and their continued belief in our work. Thank you so very much. Celebrating its 200th anniversary in 2023, the Library of Virginia is the Commonwealth's oldest cultural institution, containing over 130 million items in its collections. Touches over 4 million people each year through in-person programs, premier research facilities, and its many web and digital initiatives. If you have not already, I encourage you to support the library's work by going to lba.virginia.gov/donate. I thank you in advance for your support. If you would like to purchase a copy of today's book or other great items and gifts, visit the Virginia Shop website at thevirginiashop.org. In addition to this book, there are many new items featuring the best of Virginia literature, history, and local artisans. If you have not visited in a while, I encourage you to visit the shop website. And just before we get to some more business, I just want to remind everybody that our next Weinstein Authors Series event will take place on June 10th, 2021, with Vanessa Holden and her book, Surviving Southampton, African American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. If you would like to register for that event or any of the other Weinstein Series events, please go to lba.virginia.gov/public/Weinstein. All right, Kim Roberts. Kim Roberts is the author of By Broad Potomac Shore, Great Poems from the Early Days of Our Nation's Capital. This comprehensive anthology features poems by both well-known and overlooked poets working and living in the capital from the city's founding in 1800 to 1930. Roberts expertly presents the work of 132 poets, including poems by celebrated DC writers such as Francis Scott Key, Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Ambrose Bierce, Henry Adams, and James Weldon Johnson, as well as work by lesser known poets, especially women, writers of color, and working class writers. Kim is also the author of A Literary Guide to Washington, D.C., Walking in the Footsteps of American Writers from Francis Scott Key to Zora Neale Hurston, and 5 books of poems, most recently, The Scientific Method. Roberts has been a recipient of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Humanities DC, and the DC Commission for the Arts, and has been a writer in residence at 18 artist colonies. Poems of hers have been featured in the Wick Poetry Center's Traveling Stanzas Project, on the Academy of American Poets Poem A Day Project, and on podcasts sponsored by the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Arts. All right. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. This one is going to be a little different than maybe some of the other projects that presentations we've done in the past. And I think we're going to try to have a conversation around the book and around some of the poets within. So thank you so much, Kim, for joining us. We're really excited to have a conversation about your book and these just fantastic poets. One of the things that really stuck out to me this evening, or when I read the book, was how many of these poets were new that I hadn't known about, and I'm not sure that maybe our audience knows too much about.
Right. Thank you so much. And thank you for that lovely introduction. Yeah, of course, the point of putting together a new anthology has to be to argue with the established canon. So you mentioned a number of names of the better known poets that I include in the book. And of course, no anthology of DC poets would be complete without people like Walt Whitman and Paul Laurence Dunbar in there. But what I was really excited about was researching and discovering some voices that I think are just as worthy of being read and studied in schools, and whose legacy, for various reasons, may have been lost along the way. So for me, the point of putting together an anthology is to look for specifically working class writers, women writers, LGBTQ writers, writers of color, and to incorporate those voices in with those better known names.
Right. As I said in the introduction, the book contains 130 poets, all living and working in DC from 1800 until 1930. Why did you focus on that specific period of time when you put this together?
I was really drawn to those earlier eras because I think those stories are less well known. They're not told as often. The cutoff of 1930 for me was an important one because that's where we start to see the beginnings of literary modernism, and that sort of changes everything. But I was drawn in part to the poems of those earlier eras because poetry was not considered something that was elite during those periods. It was a part of every American's daily life. So for me, it's very important to remember that there was a time when newspapers would always publish, they would include poems along with hard news. Poetry was memorized in schools. It was set to music. It was recited at family gatherings, at community meetings. So poetry was really, it was everywhere. It was part of the daily life of families and communities. And the regular meter and rhyme that poems were written in before the advent of modernism made them easier to memorize and just added to their popularity.
One of the things that we kind of talked about when we were talking about this presentation was that it's a very complete anthology. And maybe what we wanted to try and do was try to see if we could find some pieces of it that we could do in an hour-long presentation, which we appreciate. And I think one of the things that was very interesting to me in our conversations was really talking about the poets in the book that were either currently or formerly enslaved individuals within the district. I think sometimes we pay less attention to the city itself or the district itself when we talked about slavery and slave populations versus obviously the surrounding states. Can you give us a little bit of context around what those individuals were experiencing in DC and kind of what slavery looked like in the nation's capital at the time?
Sure, yeah. You know, DC is, of course, always a special case because it's the seat of the federal government. So it's impossible to understand the history of DC and the context of these abolitionist poets without looking at that weird intertwined relationship between the federal government and the city. This is now, of course, coming back up again as Congress is debating whether to consider statehood for DC. From the start, by design, DC had this dual identity. We were seen as both a city and the nation's capital. And where inconsistencies between those two roles emerged, as of course they did immediately, Congress simply stepped in and took control. DC was very much a southern city, but because of the federal government, people came from across the country. The symbolism of the capital city made it an important proving ground for a whole wide range of social movements. Because there was no local jurisdiction that needed to be appeased or dealt with, whatever ideas came through Congress, they could just try out any of these new ideas. So for better or worse, DC has had this notable number of firsts in the nation's history. It became a sort of laboratory for reform ideals. in 1800, when my anthology starts, that is when the federal government officially moved in. They set up shop, and at that point, 25% of the population was enslaved. The total population in 1800 was under 3,000 individuals, and that first group of federal employees to move to Washington numbered 156 people, if you can believe it. That was the number needed to run the nation's government. In 1808, the importation of slaves to the US from other countries was outlawed. And of course, this didn't mean the end of slavery by any means. It certainly didn't mean the end of slave trading. What it meant was that a huge trade in humans within the US started. There was forced breeding of enslaved people. There was illegal smuggling of free people of color into slavery. And DC became a major hub for the sale of enslaved people out of the mid-Atlantic into the Deep South. Crops had changed from tobacco to more of a wheat-based economy, which did not need year-round workers. So as a result, the Deep South, which had a cotton economy, was looking to get more workers. So there was a huge trade in human lives, and in response, there was also, DC became a hub for the Underground Railroad. And writers did what writers always do. They responded with an outpouring of poems on the subjects of slavery and abolition. Poetry was seen as this unique form of moral persuasion. Arguments made in verse were considered more emotional and more forceful than other arguments made in prose. They could change people's minds. And poems were almost always included in abolitionist lectures and church services for that reason. The press had a particular influence in spreading abolitionist poetry. Both the segregated Black newspapers and the abolitionist newspapers regularly printed poems. And DC was where one of the major abolitionist newspapers was based. Gamaliel Bailey's newspaper, called The New Era, was one of the most influential of the nation's abolitionist newspapers. We'll talk a little bit more about Gamaliel Bailey and the work that he was doing.
And you had mentioned that when Washington brokered the compromise to bring the seat of government, that there was some compromises within that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that as well?
Right. So yeah, if you ever wondered why DC of all places, only someone of George Washington's reputation could have made this kind of compromise possible. In 1788, the U.S. Constitution granted Congress the authority in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, to create a district not exceeding 10 miles square for the seat of government. And Southern congressmen were determined to place the new capital in a region favorable to slavery, far from the sway of large industrialists of the Northeast. So Washington stepped in and recommended this site at the confluence of the Potomac River and the Anacostia River, which included two existing port cities, one in Maryland, one in Virginia, Alexandria and Georgetown. And Congress passed the 1790 Residency Act to move the seat of government here. Slavery was the reason why we have a southern city as our capital. According to the census data for 1790, approximately 55%, over half of the North American slave populations were centered in just two states, Maryland and Virginia. So at Washington's suggestion, the capital city was carved out of those two slave states.
I think looking ahead a little bit, you said that one of the most exciting discoveries that you had made in the book was finding a poem written by Arthur Bowen. I know we're going to read one of his poems in a moment, but do you want to tell us a little bit about him and about the poem itself?
Sure, yeah. I had long known that DC's first race riot was something called the Snowstorm. It took place in August 1835, and what I didn't know that there was a poem connected with this. I was so excited when I found this. So the snowstorm was precipitated by an alleged nighttime attack by Arthur Bowen, who was an enslaved 19-year-old, against his slave owner, Anna Marie Thornton. And as a result of what was reported in the newspapers and sort of fomented there mobs formed, and they destroyed a huge number of businesses owned and operated by people of color: restaurants, schools, one whorehouse, private homes. And Francis Scott Key, famous for our national anthem, was serving as DC's district attorney and was criminally negligent in allowing the violence to continue for several days. By the time he called in a detachment of Marines from the Navy Yard located in DC, the damage was extensive, and leading African-American citizens had to flee for their lives. The snowstorm was named for Beverly Snow, who owned one of the top restaurants in the city, a business owner of color. I knew this basic history about the snowstorm, but I thought everything that we knew about Arthur Bowen came from white observers. So I was really stunned when I found that he had actually written a poem. It was published in the same newspaper that had fomented mob violence, the National Intelligencer, published in February 1836. And when you look at the history, the news reports, the court records, his mistress's correspondence, it's just such a relief to finally find something in his own hand. And it's striking that he wanted to write it in the form of a poem, that he wanted to show his emotional life. He wanted to show his intelligence, his culture. I don't make claims for it being the best poem in the book, but it's certainly one of my favorites. So maybe we should just go to the poem, go to his text.
So Kim has asked me to help her read some of these poems this evening. I'm going to apologize now, but I'll try to do them justice. So this is Farewell by Arthur Bowen. Farewell, farewell, my young friends dear. Oh, view my dreadful state. Each flying moment brings me near into my awful fate. Brought up I was by parents nice, whose commands I would not obey, but plunged ahead foremost in device, and into temptation's dreadful way. Nothing did I ever drink but liquor very strong, though I never used to think that I was doing wrong. To me was read the awful sentence, so dreadful in my ears it rang. They gave me time for my repentance, and then I must be hanged. Goodbye, goodbye, my friends so dear. May God Almighty please you all. Do, if you please, but shed a tear at Arthur Bowen's unhappy fall.
Do you have the text of that poem that we could put up on screen, Scott?
Oh, I have it up on screen right now. Is it not showing itself? Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Yeah. No, that's very helpful. I had mentioned that he was enslaved in DC. He was born and raised in DC in the household of William Thornton, who was the architect of the Capitol. So someone who was very prominent in DC. He was a man of considerable intelligence, and he took full advantage of his urban setting. And I should note how different urban slavery was from rural slavery. He learned how to read and write probably at a church Sunday school. He befriended free men of color who made up the larger proportion of DC's population than slaves by 1830. He was allowed access to go around the city on his own. He attended public lectures. He joined a men's group, a sort of continuing education men's group called the Philomathian Talking Society. And it was after a meeting of this society where I should say abolitionist newspapers and texts were often shared. So the fears of white Southerners were, I guess, merited about groups like this. And it was after a meeting and some post-meeting drinks with friends that he then returned home. He tripped over an axe in the front hallway of his house, and he picked it up, he said later, to find a better place for it. You have to remember that axes were a very common household item. The house would have been heated by wood, but he went in to check in with his slave owner, who was a widow at that point. And he still had the axe in his hand, and he was definitely intoxicated. And she yelled out to neighbors for help, even though he claimed, and I believe, that he did not have any intent to harm the widow Thornton. He knew that he had been accused of something very serious when neighbors came out, and so he fled, and he stayed away for 3 days. He was, when he returned, imprisoned in the city jail. The National Intelligencer started publishing this series of stories about a shocking attempt made on the life of Mrs. Thornton, and that he had been evidently induced by reading inflammatory publications, and etc. So this crowd of laborers, white working class men, sort of stormed the city jail. And when they couldn't breach the jail, they started destroying property. One of the features of urban slavery was that most slave owners in DC rented out their slaves so that they would work outside of their own homes or businesses, and then the money would go back to the owners. They were in competition with these working class white workers. They could undercut their wages. So this mob just went from building to building, wreaking destruction. Bowen was brought to trial, condemned, and given the death sentence. He was scheduled to hang in February 1836, and that's when this poem appeared in the National Intelligencer. Anna Thornton greatly regretted her earlier desire to punish Arthur Bowen, and so she drew up a petition for a presidential pardon. She obtained 34 signatures from other prominent white slave owners in the city, and sent it along with a pleading 17-page letter to President Andrew Jackson. So Bowen's execution was postponed. A second appeal that summer by Thornton led to his full pardon, but as part of the settlement, Thornton agreed to sell Arthur Bowen to a new owner outside of Washington, D.C., who would agree to never let him come back to the city again. So all his family was here, everyone he knew was here. He was sold for $750 and nothing more is known of Bowen's life.
So you mentioned a few times now kind of the interaction and relationships in DC between enslaved people and free people of color. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there were only 2 cities in the South that had a larger proportion of the people of color who were free rather than enslaved, and that was Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Oh, wait, St. Louis also. There were 3 cities. Enslaved people in these 3 cities would have a lot of interaction with people who are not enslaved, and they would have a kind of autonomy to attend church services, to learn to read and write. It was really different than the isolated lives of the more rural slave populations.
How would you say the symbolic value, is the kind of the seat of American government compared in DC to how it related to the rest of the southern cities at the time?
Sure. Yeah, it's certainly why the abolitionist movement was so ardent in Washington. There were a series of slave pens located just south of the National Mall. The most notorious of them was something called the Yellow House, located on Maryland Avenue across from where today the Smithsonian Castle, the main Smithsonian building, is located. The neighborhood was important because of its proximity to the Potomac River, the wharves, and to slave markets where human beings were sold that were located right along Pennsylvania Avenue. So coffles of chained slaves who were in irons would pass right by the U.S. Capitol daily. And this was something that was, of course, greatly discussed in Northern newspapers. Abolitionists used that image of people in irons going across the Capitol lawn as a way of arguing how slavery disgraced the country's founding ideals.
All right, so I think you're going to read and talk about another poem.
Yes, yeah. Let's look at it. Let's go back to another text. The next poem I picked out is by Grace Greenwood. So Grace Greenwood was a white writer. She was a writer of children's literature. She was a journalist, and she was a women in the country called Godey's Ladies Book. She was also a correspondent for the New York Times. She books of her own. She lived in DC from 1850 to 1852 for the first time, working as a governess. I mentioned them earlier. He was the editor of the New Era newspaper. And they had this practice. They had a large family. They had a number of kids, and take in all white young women who were interested in writing. They would work as governesses, but they would also get their first publications in the New Era and other journals that Gamaliel Bailey had a connection to. And quite a few of them went on to careers as professional writers. So she had her earliest publications in the New Era, and then she moved to DC a second time after she married, living in the city again from 1871 to 1878. So this is a poem of hers called The Leap from the Long Bridge. And the Long Bridge is on the site of today's 14th Street Bridge. So that's still used as a crossover point between DC and Northern Virginia. At the time, it was a wooden toll bridge spanning the Potomac River that opened in 1809. Union troops occupied it during the Civil War. So really a very important bridge. So she starts the poem by saying an incident at Washington. She wants to make sure that you know that this was based on fact. A woman once made her escape from the slave prison, which stands midway between the Capitol and the President's house, and ran to the Long Bridge, crossing the Potomac to the extensive grounds and woodlands of Arlington Place. The leap from the Long Bridge. No rest for the wretched. The long day is past, and night on yon prison descendeth at last. Now lock up and bolt. Ha, jailer, look here, who flies like a wild bird escaped from the snare. A woman, a slave, up, out in pursuit, while linger some gleams of the day. Ho, rally thy hunters with halloo and shout to chase down the game and away. A bold race for freedom. On, fugitive, on. Heaven help but the right, and thy freedom is won. How eager she drinks the free air of the plains. Every limb, every nerve, every fiber she strains. From Columbia's glorious capital, Columbia's daughter flees to the sanctuary God hath given, the sheltering forest trees. Now she treads the Long Bridge. Joy lighteth her eye. Beyond her the dense wood and darkening sky. Wild hopes thrill her breast as she neareth the shore. Oh, despair, there are men fast advancing before. Shame, shame on their manhood. They hear, they heed the cry, her flight to stay. And like demon forms with their outstretched arms, they wait to seize their prey. She pauses, she turns. Ah, will she flee back? Like wolves, her pursuers howl loud on her track. She lifteth to heaven one look of despair. Her anguish breaks forth in one hurried prayer. Hark, her jailers yell, like a bloodhound's bay on the low night wind it sweeps. Now death or the chain, to the stream she turns, and she leaps. Oh God, she leaps. The dark and the cold yet merciful wave receives to its bosom the form of the slave. She raises, earth's scenes on her dim vision gleam, but she struggleth not with the strong, rushing stream. And low are the death cries her woman's heart gives as she floats adown the river. Faint and more faint grows her drowning voice, and her cries have ceased forever. Now back, jailer, back to thy dungeons again, to swing the red lash and rivet the chain. The form thou wouldst fetter, a valueless clod. The soul thou wouldst barter, returned to her God. She lifts in his light her unmanacled hands. She flees to the darkness no more. To freedom she leaped, though through drowning and death and bondage are o'er. I think it's an amazing, just such an emotional plea to readers to put themselves in her position. I think especially for a lot of white readers at that time, that would have been a sort of shocking proposition. She's asking you to think about what you would do if you were an enslaved person being pursued in this way. And that the fact that she chose death over re-enslavement, I think speaks volumes. I love how she addresses the jailers directly and says shame, shame on their manhood, really stood out to me. And then of course those lines at the very end go back to swing the red lash and rivet the chain. That red lash, you know, that the bloody lash is the imagery is just very powerful to me.
Yeah, really, that's a fascinating poem, and I think that the background that as you're explaining that is really interesting as well. I wouldn't have thought about how controversial is not quite the right word, but how different it would have been writing from that perspective at the time. Very interesting. why don't you tell us, we talked a little bit earlier about kind of the abolitionist movement kind of being somewhat centered in DC. Can you talk about the poems, or were any of the poems directly related to a lot of the battles that were being waged in Congress about slavery at the time?
Yeah. So the very first petition that the U.S. Congress received to abolish slavery was presented in 1829. That's fairly early on in the city's history. In 1834, the American Anti-Slavery Society began a nationwide petition drive. Despite citizens' constitutional by the First Amendment to petition the government for a redress of grievances, Congress quickly got so overwhelmed by petitions from all across the nation, but especially from northern states, that they passed this resolution, famous resolution known as the gag rule, which tabled any action on petitions relating to slavery from 1836 to 1844. So that's a very long time that Congress people were banned from having any discussion about these petitions that kept coming in. So I picked out a poem. The next poem that I'd like to do is by John Pierpont, who was a minister, so he had that sort of religious authority to his voice. Also a teacher, a very well-regarded educator. He helped establish the English Classical School in Boston. He was involved in politics for a while. He ran unsuccessfully for governor of Massachusetts and for the U.S. House of Representatives. But he's best remembered as an activist, if he's remembered at all. And he was ardently abolitionist and contributed regularly to abolitionist newspapers. So I was really quite pleased when I found this one particular poem that directly addresses the gag rule. Who would have thought that would be a good inspiration for poetry? But it's a direct threat to Congress for ignoring those petitions. Do you want to read it?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm going from the book. A word from a petitioner. What? Our petitions spurn? The prayer of thousands, tens of thousands, cast, unheard beneath your speaker's chair. But you will hear us first or last. The thousands that last year ye scorned are millions now. Be warned, be warned. Turn not contemptuous on your heel. It is not for an act of grace that suppliants at your feet we kneel. We stand, we look you in the face and say, and we have waited the word, that our petitions shall be heard. There are two powers above the laws. Ye make or mar, they're our allies. Beneath their shield we urge your cause. Through all your hands against us rise. We're proved them, and we know their might, the Constitution, and the right. We say not ye shall sap the links that bind you to your dreadful slaves. Hug, if you will, a corpse that stinks, and toil on with your graves. But that ye may go coupled thus, ye never shall make slaves of us. And what but more than slaves are they, who are told they ne'er shall be denied the right of prayer, yet when they pray, their prayers unheard are thrown aside? Such mockery they will tamely bear, who are fit an iron chain to wear. Nay, start not from your chairs in dread of cannon shot or bursting shell. These shall not fall upon your head, as once upon your house they fell. We have a weapon, firmer set, and better than that bayonet. A weapon that comes down as still as snowflakes fall upon the sod, but executes a freeman's will. As lightning does the will of God, and from its force, nor doors nor locks can shield you to the ballot box.
I love that ending where, you know, he's basically saying, listen to our petitions or you are being voted out of Congress the next time.
Yeah.
We still have the vote.
Yeah.
We may have the gag rule, but we still have the vote.
When I was paying attention to the number of exclamation points where he was really trying to make the point, while at the same time trying to remind myself, don't yell at those points because that was there.
Yeah, no, he's very emphatic. This is something that really fascinated me. The more research I did was how leaders of color and white abolitionists started working together, and that these networks in DC were so strong. Some of the strongest networks in the country. The 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which still exists, it was established in 1841 as a African American church, took a leading role in bringing together white supporters and the African American worshipers to raise funds to purchase people out of bondage, to pay legal fees, and to finance escapes through the Underground Railroad. I mentioned Gamaliel Bailey and his wife Margaret also. She's included in the anthology, although we're not looking at her poems. National Era is best remembered as Tom's Cabin was first published in serialized form, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. It continued publication through 1860. And the Baileys had a home right in downtown DC, a large home that was a real gathering place for Northern white congressmen to meet with all of the local abolitionists. It was, there's good anecdotal evidence that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, although we can't prove that, obviously. There was a lot of support for educational efforts for efforts for students that came through these networks as well. White Northerners helped pay for salaries of African American teachers and for the buying of school buildings. So there was this cooperative movement that was multiracial, that's sort of surprising to see at that time period, and of course happening right under the noses of legislators. So I had mentioned that Gail Hamilton got her start in the household of Margaret and Gamaliel Bailey. There's another poet who also got her start there, Gail Hamilton, and I wanted to read just a short poem of hers that was written in tribute to Gamaliel Bailey. There it is, thank you. Gail Hamilton was born in Massachusetts. She became a governess in the Bailey family in 1856. Went on to publish poetry, essays. She became a professional journalist. Published several books. I love this short poem, To Dr. Bailey with a Pair of Gloves, Christmas. I fear it will seem an Hibernian stroke to mark the sincerest of loves by begloving a man whose great glory it is that he handles all sin without gloves. For I pray that the glove in old times was a signal of, but remember, old signal of mortal defiance. And in these evil days, if a man can be found on whom Christendom places reliance, who always stands ready to shiver a lance for the love of the right, not renown, It is surely the least his admirers can do to provide him with gloves to throw down. We know that his presses were smashed by the anti-abolitionist mobs a couple of times. There was one time in particular where the whole family had to flee for their lives. It was not a small thing for him to be publishing this very prominent abolitionist newspaper. It was extremely dangerous work, and his life was often in danger. He was threatened constantly.
Let me ask you, a question just came up that's related to this poem, so I thought I would just ask it really quick.
Yep.
The question is, the women poets seem to be, aka also known as, is this the difference between married and maiden names, or rather an attempt to remain anonymous?
Yeah, so you have to remember that this was a period when women were not supposed to be, their lives were supposed to be in the house, not out in the world. And so a number of the women writers at this time took on different names to publish under. So this is not a difference between their married name or their single name as we might expect, but these were pseudonyms that were taken on. And that was a way for them to protect their modesty. If they were radical writers, it was also a way to protect their safety. So it does make the research into these, researching these women's lives so much more difficult. There were a lot of abolitionist newspapers that I looked at regularly, trying to uncover some of these women writers, and they published a lot of poems anonymously, or women might take a pen name that was just one single name, you know, Corinne, or you know, it's very hard to tie those to the actual authors. So there are challenges in researching women authors from this period.
Thank you. Can you tell us about some of the poets of color that were involved in the abolitionist movement?
Yeah, so there were quite, DC was a huge gathering point for leaders, Black leaders of the abolitionist movement. And I think it's really important to mention their names, especially since so many of them also wrote poetry. So I would say Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, William Slade, the Reverend John Sella Martin. Those are all names that I wish all of us knew better. Those are all, I feel like their writings should be known to all of us. African-American men who are instrumental in developing these networks that I talked about, reaching out to white supporters, supporting people who had escaped out of slavery. There were a lot of activity around paying the purchase price to buy enslaved, also just people out of slavery, building networks that would promote political autonomy for people of color. And in the anthology, I include a range of people who started their lives enslaved and then became writers of note in the eras after the end of slavery. T. Thomas Forten, we'll talk a little bit more about him, Newell Houston Ensley, John Henry Painter, Alfred Islay Walden are some of the folks that I have included in the anthology. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the escape on the Pearl. That was the largest slave escape ever attempted anywhere in the US, and it started from Washington, DC. And that was a direct collaboration between Black and white abolitionists. It took In April 1848, 77 people sailed on this, and it was planned by these leaders of color, but it was financed by white supporters. Unfortunately, tragically, there were these strong winds that were inhibiting the ship's escape. It was captured and was towed back to Washington, D.C. Attacked the national. This was one of the times when the and smashed the presses. The Bailey family fled for their lives. But more significantly than any damage done to the Baileys, I would say many of the owners of enslaved people who'd been part of that escape retaliated. They decided they did not want to bring these escapees back into their households. So nearly 1/3 of the recaptured slaves from the Pearl were sold into the Deep South. There was this multiracial coalition who tried to raise purchase prices and to buy as many of the escapees as possible, but as I said, that was only a small portion who were able to be bought out of slavery in that way. Frederick Douglass is famous for writing about the Pearl incident, saying, "Slaves escaping from the capital of the monarch. What an idea, running from the Temple of Liberty to be free."
Yeah, Frederick Douglass, most known for his autobiographies, but you included 2 of his poems in the anthology as well.
Yeah, that's right. Douglass, of course, known for his memoirs, but he was a very fine poet, and I do include 2 of his poems in the anthology. I should say that the major literary tools that the abolitionists had were memoirs such as the one that Frederick Douglass wrote, and the series of poems, the poems that kept being recited at abolitionist meetings and published in newspapers.
I know this was a time when a lot of these rebellions and mass escapes, if you will, were covered pretty heavily in the newspapers. How did that impact DC at the time and the lawmakers and even some of the poets that were in the city at the time?
Yeah, I wanted to read a poem next about Nat Turner and the Nat Turner Rebellion. Probably your listeners have heard, at least heard his name. He led a rebellion of enslaved Virginians in the southern part of the state, in Southampton County, in August 1831. Turner was a minister. He was literate, despite literacy being against the law for a slave. By all accounts, a very charismatic natural leader. Although the rebellion was suppressed after a couple of days, he led this group of approximately 70 people of color who traveled from house to house, freeing approximately 60 people and killing the white owners, using revolutionary violence to awaken whites to the brutality of slaveholding. And of course, this led to a range of legal measures in response. White slave owners were terrified to think that this might be a model for future violence. So state legislatures across the country enacted new laws that would prohibit education of people of color, restrict rights of assembly, require white ministers to be present at all worship services for enslaved people. There was just this huge range of laws in response. I think without question the Nat Turner Rebellion hastened the onset of the Civil War. It certainly brought this controversial subject of African American self-emancipation into a national discussion. So you have pulled up this wonderful poem by T. Thomas Forten. So Forten, you should know, he got his start in Washington, D.C. He was a student at Howard University, although didn't graduate. but he took his first job as a journalist in DC as a reporter for the People's Advocate newspaper. And then he would go on to become the editor of one of, without question, the top African-American newspapers in the country, the New York Age. So this is a poem that he wrote to memorialize Nat Turner, to show how indebted he was to Nat Turner.
All right, Nat Turner. He stood erect, a man as proud as ever to a tyrant bowed, unwilling heed or bent a knee, and longed while bending to be free. And o'er his even features came a shadow, 'twas of manly shame. I shame that he should wear a chain and feel his manhood writhed in pain, doomed to a life of plodding toil, shamefully rooted to the soil. He stood erect, his eyes flashed fire, his robust form convulsed with ire. I will be free, or fighting, die a man, cried he. Virginia's hills were lit at night, the slave had risen in his might, and far and near Nat's wail went forth to south, to east, and west and north. And strong men trebled in their power, and weak men felt 'twas now their hour. I will be free, or fighting, die a man, cried he. The tyrant's arm was all too strong, he swayed dominion all too long. And so the hero met his end, as all who fall as freedom's friend. The blow he struck shook slavery's throne, his cause was just, in skeptics' own, and round his lowly grave soon swarmed freedom's brave hosts for freedom armed. That host was swollen by Nat's kin. To fight for freedom, freedom win. Upon the soil that spurned his cry, I will be free, or I will die. Let tyrants quake in their power, for sure will come the awful hour when they must give an answer why heroes in chains should basely die, instead of rushing to the field and counting battle ere they yield.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that. Let tyrants quake. That is surely meant to provoke white readers, and you know, the argument is very strongly held that there are some things that require a violent response, and if slavery is not one of those things, what would be? I love the use of the refrain in this poem, "Our fighting die a man," said he. I will be free.
Well, yeah, it's a very powerful poem for sure, and I agree with you on the refrain. It's in reading it, trying to find the right way to express that. I hope I did it justice. And just to mention it again, because I do like synergy when we look at our series programming. Just remember that on June 10th, Dr. Vanessa Holden is coming to talk about her book, Surviving Southampton, African American Women in the Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. So I do think that maybe while we're not going to get more into it today, I hope that next program will help provide greater context to this poem and some of the things that we're discussing today. So to move on a little bit, for just a little bit of context, can you talk about the connection between retrocession of parts of what are now Northern Virginia and how that was connected to the trading of enslaved peoples?
Sure, yeah. So you know that the original shape of DC was a perfect diamond shape of 10 square miles. and that the Potomac River sort of flowed between it. In 1847, the part of the district that had been on the western side of the Potomac River was retroceded back to Virginia. So that portion of the original 100 square miles that now make up Alexandria City and Arlington County went back to Virginia. They constitute about 31 square miles. Those living in the retroceded parts of what are now today Northern Virginia regained their right to vote. They regained their voting representatives in Congress. But more significantly, the Compromise of 1850 outlawed the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and those businesses were able to move across the Potomac River and continue dealing in the slave trade, the sale of enslaved people, which was a major part of the economy of the region. So retrocession was directly related to slavery. It was white slave traders were trying to protect their business from what they considered legislative meddling.
Well, I'm going to move ahead a little bit to make sure that we have time to read the remaining, I think, 2 more poems I want to make sure that we can get to. You picked a very powerful poem by the Reverend John Sella Martin. Would you like to talk about that a little bit and maybe read that work?
Sure. John Sella Martin is one of the, poets that I'm Avery from Alabama in 1856. Made his way to Boston and became a celebrated minister, and then came to DC in 1869 to become pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which I mentioned was a sort of center of the abolitionist movement in DC. He wrote journalism and poetry into sermons, published widely in newspapers. So this is his poem called The Sentinel of Freedom. He starts with an epigraph, "Watchman, what of the night? The storm has begun, the thunders are pealing, the lightnings of truth like the stern flashing eye of justice that sleeps now, of vengeance unfeeling, are bursting from clouds in their conflict on high. The winds of discussion, like the plowshares of terror, sink deep neath the surface of slavery's dead sea, and the monsters of crime on the billows of error appear to the horrified gaze of the free." This is a longer poem. I'm going to skip over a couple of the stanzas and just go to the last 2. "But all is in vain. The heavens grow thicker with portents of dread to oppression's weak soul, and almighty truth flashes brighter and quicker, while terrific reason in thunders still roll. The earthquake is shattering their prisons to pieces amid the eruptions of volcanic speech, while whirlwinds and torrents in fury increases, though tyrants alternately curse and beseech. And thus shall it be until freedom shall cover with an ocean of light our nation so dark, till justice and mercy united shall hover o'er manhood untrammeled in liberty's arc. Then 'neath truth's great sunlight, by conflict unfaded, and earth renovated by fire and flood, shall man in his majesty stand under the Lord of creation, the stand underrated, the Lord of image of God. Martin really was using his authority as a religious leader to talk about the immorality of slavery.
I was wrong. We have 2 more poems. Can you tell us a little bit about the Reverend Henry McNeill Turner and his poem 1 Year Ago Today.
Sure, yeah. Turner was another religious leader who also wrote poetry. He was born free in South Carolina, was self-educated until he went to college. He enrolled in Trinity College in Baltimore, and that's where he received his first formal education. And if he's remembered at all today, is remembered because he was appointed by President Abraham Lincoln to serve as the first African-American chaplain for the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. But he led pastorates in St. Louis, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Savannah, Georgia. And he led the congregation in D.C. at Union Bethel Church. He also edited 2 Black nationalist newspapers and published several books. And this is, I think, an important poem to read today. This poem was read from the pulpit at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church on April 16th, 1863. It was reprinted in the Liberator newspaper, and it commemorates DC's special status as the first place slavery was officially ended and the only place where slave owners were compensated financially. 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, nearly 3,100 people held in bondage in Washington, D.C. To this day in D.C., we celebrate Emancipation Day. It's a citywide holiday, and that will take place tomorrow. We're recording this on April 15th. Every year, April 16th, we remember Emancipation Day. And so this is the poem that Henry Mcneill Turner wrote for the very first anniversary of Emancipation Day. Will you read it?
Yeah, absolutely. 1 year ago today, dedicated to the emancipated slaves of the District of Columbia. Almighty God, we praise thy name, for having heard we pray, for having freed us from our chains 1 year ago today. We thank thee for thy arm has stayed, bowed despotism's sway, and made Columbia's district free 1 year ago today. Give us the power to withstand oppression's baleful fray, that right may triumph as it did 1 year ago today. Give liberty to millions yet, 'neath despotism's sway, that they may praise thee as we did 1 year ago today. O guide us safely through the storm, bless Lincoln's gentle sway, and then we'll ever praise thee as 1 year ago today. So you wanted to end our conversation today with a poem by Charlotte Forten Grimke. I hope I said that right.
Yeah, I know we're running late on this, but it's one of my favorite poems. So we will quickly go through. So Charlotte Forten Grimke, African American author of mostly poetry but also some essays, appeared in her lifetime in the Atlantic Monthly, New England Magazine, a couple of other white-owned publications. And she was very active in the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which I keep mentioning because her husband was one of the pastors there. Francis Grimke was the minister. And this is a poem that she wrote for the end of the Civil War. At the very end of the war, all of the troops were massed together one last time to do this huge parade down Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the US Capitol. And she was there. She was an actual witness to it. So this poem picks up on some of the excitement of being present there. This is called The Gathering of the Grand Army. Through all the city streets there poured a flood of human souls, eager, intent. One thought, one purpose stirred the people's blood, and through their veins its quickening current sent. The flags waved gaily in the summer air, o'er patient watchers 'neath the clouded skies. Old age and youth and infancy were there, the glad light shining in expectant eyes. And when at last our country's saviors came in proud procession down the crowded street, still brighter burned the patriotic flame, and loud acclaims leaped forth their steps to greet. And now the veterans scarred and maimed appear, and now the tattered battle flags uprise. A silence deep one moment fills the air, then shout on shout ascends unto the skies. Strain and ye have discussed. Oh, brothers, ye have borne the battle strain, ye have felt it through the lingering years. For deeds, your hours of pain, we can but give you our grateful tears. And now with heads bowed low and tear-filled eyes, we see a silent army passing slow. For it no music swells, no shouts arise, but silent blessings from our full hearts flow. The dead, the living, all, a glorious host, a cloud of witnesses around us press. Shall we, like them, stand faithful at our post, or weakly yield, unequal to the stress? Shall it be said the land they fought to save, ungrateful now, proves faithless to her trust? Shall it be said the sons of sires so brave now trail her scarred banner in the dust? Ah, no. Again shall rise the people's voice, as once it rose in accents clear and high. O outraged brother, lift your head, rejoice. Justice shall reign, insult and wrong shall die. So shall this day the joyous promise be of golden days for our fair land in store, when freedom's flag shall float above the free, and love and peace prevail from shore to shore.
Wow.
And I love how that poem just brings all of the hopes for a new nation rising out of all of the sacrifices of all the long war years. I also love how she invokes, we have the actual soldiers marching down the street, but then we have her imagining the dead coming back and marching down the street as well. I find it very moving.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a fantastic poem. I appreciate you brought it to all of us and shared these works and all of these works. I do recommend, if you haven't purchased it already, please go out and get the book. I really liked it because it was very, the way that it's arranged with the biographies of the poet and then the poems made it really easy to kind of process both from a subject matter standpoint and a timeline. And I'm a simple person in a lot of ways, and I really enjoyed that because it made it really easy for me to process and read through it. I recommend that everybody goes out and gets it. You can also, as I said, get it from the Virginia Shop, which is the library's own store. We have one more question that I did think was interesting, so I wanted to make sure that it got asked before we ended. How did you decide, or why did you decide as the 1930s as the cutoff for the anthology's time frame?
Yeah, so initially I was just going to look at poems for the first century, so 1800 to 1900, but it actually seemed to make better sense to look at poems leading up through the beginnings of literary modernism. So where the styles of writing changed so dramatically, and that's why I ended a few decades past that full century mark. I wanted to say one more thing, which while this is important history, I do think that it continues to be relevant. So many of these poems, these abolitionist poems, for me, it's hard not to think of the Black Lives Matter movement. I just think this is crucial history for all Americans to learn. And I think that the abolitionist poets, they're written specifically to give readers this unique window into the emotional life of those involved in the movement. So I think that they're just important as primary texts for understanding the history in a different way.
Well, and especially relevant both in DC and where we are in Richmond, which is really a center point of a lot of these conversations right now. And I agree that it's always good to know your history, especially as it pertains to the world today. So we really do thank you for bringing this to our attention, for sharing this work with us, for sharing this book. Thank you so much. Again, thank you to Carol and Marcus Weinstein for helping to make this series possible. I would remind everybody, if they'd like to support this program or others of the library's work, please visit lva.virginia.gov/donate. And we appreciate any support that you'd be interested in giving. So that we love sharing these kind of programs with you and these authors with you. So thank you. Again, please go out and purchase the book. I believe it's UVA Press, and it's available both in the Virginia shop, but I'm sure there's other local booksellers that you can purchase it at as well. And then just as we finish out, I just want to remind everybody about our future presentations. On June 10th, Vanessa Holden, Surviving Southampton, African-American Women in the Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. September 14th, which we're hoping will be our first in-person event, or one of our first in-person events for the series. Karen Cox will be joining us for her new book, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. We're very excited about that book. I believe it'll be the first presentation of that specific book in Richmond, so we're excited to host her for that. And then on November 17th, 21, we'll be bringing in the author Alexis Coe. You'll Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington, New York Times bestseller, and we hope that you can join us for that as well. With that, I thank you all, and really have a fantastic evening. Thank you again, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening.